The resonance of weeping radiated throughout the palace without cessation, and no soul possessed the capability to extinguish those piercing cries. The twin princesses of the Alpha King, destined to be the most shielded infants, were instead shrieking as if the entire world were devouring them. The wet nurses surrendered, the healers failed. Even the king himself proved incapable of silencing his own progeny, until a scorned maid inadvertently entered. No soul paid her heed. No soul conjectured she possessed the right to touch royalty. But when Aurelia placed her hand upon the chest of an infant, everything stalled. The weeping vanished. The entire chamber submerged into silence. And then, the two princesses transitioned their eyes open, beholding her as if they had awaited her for an eternity. They clung to her without relenting, refusing to permit any other individual to approach. Yet the entity that induced terror throughout the palace was not that miracle. It was the reaction of the Alpha King when he beheld her. He was not surprised, not grateful. He looked at her as if observing an entity that inherently should not exist, and spoke, "I should have slaughtered you the instant you were born." Part 1. The Impossible. Chapter 1. Cries in the Night. The palace of Alpha King Valerius Drake, which inherently should have remained tranquil until a solitary night, had its silence lacerated by a weeping that no soul possessed the capability to cease. The crying persisted, not weakening but intensifying with a strident ferocity, as if rending the very stillness of the nocturnal air. It pierced through the dense stone walls, winding through every frigid corridor, striking directly at the chest of any individual who perceived it. This was no ordinary infant lament, but a high, hurried, and desperate resonance, as if those 2-minute beings were terrified of an entity invisible to all others. No soul dared to speak with a raised voice that night. The receding corridors were submerged in a feeble amber luminosity. Every footfall was hurried and cautious, as if fearing the awakening of something even more formidable than the weeping itself. And the most terrifying aspect was that not a single individual among them fathomed the rationale. "How long has he remained within?" A trembling whisper rose. 3 watches, no one dares to enter. And the 2 princesses, still weeping. A heavy silence descended. No one articulated the thought, yet all understood that if those 2 infants did not cease their lament, someone would be forced to pay a price, and no soul desired to be that individual. In the east wing of the palace, the nursery door swung open. A wet nurse rushed out, her eyes crimson and hands vibrating, nearly stumbling upon the frigid stone floor. "I cannot perform this. I truly cannot." Behind her, the weeping erupted, high and relentless, to an extent that induced a desire to obstruct one's ears. 2 cradles sat adjacent to one another, 2-minute forms writhing within soft silk, countenances flushed crimson, tiny hands clenched as if offering resistance to the entire world. A healer recoiled, countenance pallid. They do not acquiesce to anyone, as if— "Silence," the steward snapped, his voice as taut as a wire. "Do not articulate entities that should not be spoken." Yet he himself did not dare to approach, for they all had attempted and all had failed. No soul dared to mention the other matter, yet it hovered in the atmosphere, as heavy as the nocturnal sky exterior because Queen Seraphina had vanished. No farewell, no vestige, leaving behind only 2 infants not yet a month old, and an Alpha King growing increasingly sinister. Remote from that location, in a shadowed corner of the palace where luminosity never reached, Aurelia bowed her head over the basin. Frigid water cut into her flesh, grease clinging so firmly it made her hands crimson and fractured. Yet she offered no reaction. She had grown accustomed to being invisible unless someone required an object for their animosity. A fragment of discarded food was flung directly at her. "Be cautious, you useless entity." Chuckling rose from behind. Aurelia did not turn. She continued to scour the bowl in her hand as if it were the solitary task maintaining her equilibrium here. "Do you perceive it?" A voice rose, half curious and half malicious. That weeping. Aurelia stalled for only a beat, yet it was sufficient to hear more clearly. The crying from the east wing persisted, thin, sharp, and suffocatingly painful. "I heard everyone has surrendered," the other continued. "Perhaps those infants are cursed, or they are merely invoking their mother." Aurelia slightly constricted her grip, not fathoming why every time that resonance reached her, her chest ached, not with physical pain, but with an anomalous sensation, as if an entity were hauling her toward that location, as if she should not be standing here. A minute rodent crawled from the corner, scenting the air then halting, its dark eyes directed toward Aurelia. It did not flee, did not fear, merely standing immobile as if listening. Nearby, a feline stalking its prey abruptly stalled, ears erect, its gaze shifting to Aurelia, then slowly taking a step in withdrawal, as if refusing to approach. But Aurelia did not recognize this. She merely stood there, hands still immersed in the frigid water, yet her respiration had grown disordered. In the east wing, the two small princesses, Elara and Lyra, continued to shriek into the darkness. Yet this time it was divergent from before. Not merely terror, not merely agony, but as if they were searching. And the individual they sought stood in the shadows, only several corridors away. And not a single soul within the palace knew that this weeping would mutate everything. Chapter 2. The touch that mutated everything. The weeping no longer resembled the cries of infants. It fractured in waves, sharp and high, like wind shrieking through stone fissures, then abruptly descended into stifled, low, and guttural resonances that induced a chill along one's spine. Within the nursery, the atmosphere grew viscous as if throttled. A wet nurse held one of the twin princesses firmly, yet her arms vibrated uncontrollably. The infant within her grasp refused to settle, her minute frame arched and tensed, tiny hands clawing at the air, as if resisting an invisible entity. Her eyes were wide and drenched, yet deep within lay something feral and anxious, like the instinct of a creature being severed from its pack. "This is impossible." The wet nurse nearly dissolved into tears. The princess does not acquiesce. In the adjacent cradle, the other shrieked, the resonance more echoing, more hurried, as if in response, as if invoking one another, like two desolate howls lost in the nocturnal gloom. A healer recoiled, countenance pallid. "They are not merely weeping, they are reacting." "Reacting to what?" the steward rasped, yet no soul answered, for no soul dared to contemplate the response. On the divergent side of the palace, Aurelia stood immobile, yet this time she could not ignore it. That weeping was no longer remote. It resonated directly within her chest. An anomalous sensation diffused, like an invisible cord constricting then hauling her in a solitary direction. Lucid, irresistible. The bowl in her hand slipped, shattering upon the frigid stone floor, yet she did not stoop, did not react, nor did she turn when someone behind her bellowed. Aurelia walked, every pace slow yet certain, as if her frame were moving of its own volition without the requirement of will. The receding corridors passed before her eyes, lamplight flickering across her countenance, and no soul obstructed her, for to them, she was never an entity worthy of notice. The weeping provided the orientation. Every footfall made that resonance clearer, sharper, as if it were invoking her in a language only she comprehended. When Aurelia stood before the nursery door, she halted. Her hand rose slightly, yet did not touch. Within, the weeping erupted, so violent it made the air vibrate, and amidst it was a flickering sound, nearly a snarl, that made one's skin crawl. Aurelia ceased reflection. She pushed the door. The door transitioned open, and the resonance struck her like a potent surge, sharp and feral. Everyone within the chamber turned in unison, gazes stalling upon her with surprise, irritation, and scorn. "Who are you?" The steward furrowed his brow. "Who permitted your entry?" But Aurelia heard nothing. Her gaze had stalled upon the two cradles, where the small princesses Elara and Lyra lay. 2-minute frames were struggling with themselves. Their weeping was no longer a lament, but a summons. The one nearest to her abruptly stalled for a solitary beat, the resonance deviating. Its eyes transitioned open, searching, then stalled upon Aurelia. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Aurelia advanced. "Do not touch them," a shout rose, yet she did not cease, as if she were incapable of halting. Her hand rose, trembling slightly, then touched down. In that precise instant, the weeping vanished. Not fading, not softening, but vanishing utterly, as if those cries had never existed. The space fell into absolute silence. The infant drew a profound breath, its tiny frame relaxing, its minute hand slowly grasping her finger. In the adjacent cradle, the other grew silent as well. No requirement for touch, no necessity for soothing, only her presence was sufficient. Aurelia slightly withdrew her hand, and immediately the weeping returned, more violent, more feral. The infant struggled, hands reaching toward her, countenance flushed, the frame tensing as if repudiating the entire world. A wet nurse hurriedly lifted her, yet she shrieked more violently, refusing, not acquiescing. "It is not us," the healer shook his head, voice vibrating. "It was never us." Aurelia advanced. This time she lifted the infant. Immediately, it grew silent. The other erupted into weeping. She turned, lifting the second. And then both remained silent and docile within Aurelia's embrace. 2-minute frames automatically nestled into her, respiration gradually stabilizing, clinging to her as if it were the solitary place they could perceive warmth and security. No soul in that chamber dared to utter a word, for they all understood that what had recently transpired was not luck, but an entity deeper, more primordial, and far more perilous. Chapter 3. Perilous Bond. The silence did not persist for long. Only minutes after the two princesses ceased their weeping within Aurelia's embrace, the entire palace commenced a commotion. News diffused swifter than fire upon parched grass. A maid, a wolfless entity, had performed what they all had failed to achieve. Within the nursery, the atmosphere became suffocatingly tense. A wet nurse advanced, her voice cautious, requesting to attempt holding the infant. Aurelia hesitated for a beat, then transferred Elara to her. Only a second later, the weeping erupted, violent and sharp, as if being lacerated from deep within the chest. The minute frame arched and tensed, tiny hands flailing in the air as if searching for the entity recently stripped away. Lyra, within Aurelia's arms, erupted in lament as well, requiring no touch or rationale, as if an invisible cord between them had been snapped. "Return her to that woman," a healer blurted, voice vibrating. Aurelia hurriedly received her, and immediately, silence fell with a terrifying celerity. The two infants settled, nestling into her and clinging firmly as if it were the solitary place they could breathe. No soul articulated it, yet all understood this was not mere soothing, but a deliberate choice. "Perform it again," the steward commanded, his voice hoarse as if repudiating the recent observation. Another wet nurse advanced, striving to haul Lyra from Aurelia's grasp. The instant that hand touched her, the infant emitted a sound no longer resembling a cry. A faint, sharp, and anomalous snarl that made any witness experience a chill. The minute frame tensed, eyes transitioned open, pupils vibrating as if reacting to an invisible menace. The air within the room constricted. "Stop!" the healer shrieked. "Do you not perceive?" Aurelia immediately held Lyra firmly, and everything settled instantly, as if a tempest had been extinguished. No soul dared a further attempt. No soul could longer deny that those two infants did not merely require Aurelia, they belonged to her. The door transitioned open. The resonance was not loud, yet sufficient to make everyone go rigid. No soul turned immediately until that figure entered. Alpha King Valerius Drake. The atmosphere mutated instantly, heavier, colder, more stifling. That man required no raised voice or mandate. Merely his presence was sufficient to make the entire room bow. Stories regarding him were never spoken aloud, yet all knew. The Alpha King was the sort of individual who could decide to slaughter an entity without blinking and sleep tranquilly that night as if nothing had transpired. His gaze raked over everything like a frigid blade, bearing no emotion, only judgment. All bowed. No soul dared a profound respiration. Only Aurelia remained standing, the two infants still curled within her arms. Valerius said nothing. His gaze swept the room, stalling at the two vacant cradles, then shifting to Aurelia. He faltered for a very brief beat, yet it was enough for the observant to recognize it was not surprise, but recognition. And immediately following that, the gaze grew cold, deep and dark, as if devouring everything. Elara stirred slightly. Lyra constricted her grip upon Aurelia's garment. Valerius approached with slow and controlled paces, every footfall seemingly compressing the air further. When he was only several paces away, the two infants commenced weeping again, not loud but distinct, a resonance of anxiety and vigilance. One of them emitted a very faint snarl, enough to make a healer turn pallid. Valerius halted, his gaze lowered, looking directly at Aurelia, not as if beholding an ordinary servant, but as if observing a distorted entity that inherently should not exist. "You." His voice was low and cold, bearing nearly no emotion. Aurelia did not fathom why her frame went rigid. Not merely terror, but an anomalous sensation, as if she had stood before this gaze a long duration ago. Valerius stalled for a beat, his gaze constricting, then spoke, every word falling like a categorical sentence. "You inherently should not exist." No soul in the chamber dared a respiration. That utterance was not a reprimand, but a verdict. The two infants in Aurelia's arms constricted their grip, clinging to her as if resisting the very man standing before them. And for the first time within his own chamber, Alpha King Valerius Drake recognized an entity. His two tiny daughters did not choose him. They chose her. Part 2. Plummeting to the Abyss. Chapter 4. The death sentence. Remove them. The voice of the Alpha King rose, not loud, not filled with rage, but sufficient to make the entire room freeze. I commanded, separate them. 2 wet nurses exchanged looks, no soul desiring to advance, yet they eventually had to approach. Aurelia constricted her hold upon the 2 infants by instinct, her heart hammering, a vague terror surfacing that she herself did not fathom. Do not, she uttered incredibly faint. Not knowing whom she was invoking, 2 hands touched her, hauling with force. Aurelia was jerked backward, and immediately, the weeping erupted. No longer the lament of infants, but a resonance lacerating the air, feral and desolate. No, this time Aurelia truly reacted. She reached out, striving to retain them, but Elara had been hauled from her embrace. The minute frame arched, tiny hands reaching toward her, yet failing to touch. Lyra in the remaining hand also erupted into violent weeping, not because of being touched, but because of being severed. An entity within Aurelia fractured abruptly. An instant flashed within Aurelia's mind, white luminosity, a warm embrace, then vanishing. A hand hauling her away, potent and decisive. Weeping rose, not her own, yet making her chest ache until she was breathless. The present rushed back. Please, they are in agony, her voice fractured. She did not fathom. She merely touched the 2 princesses, and they had ceased their lament. So, where had she erred? Hold them firmly, a wet nurse shrieked. Elara bellowed, no longer a cry, but a low, guttural, and feral resonance. The minute frame tensed, eyes wide, no longer innocent. A healer recoiled, countenance pallid. Do you perceive? Silence. Valerius had no requirement to look, no necessity to raise his voice. A solitary word was sufficient to silence all. Lyra was also hauled from Aurelia's hands. In that instant, her chest felt as if it were being rent apart. A frigid sensation of vacancy rushed in. Another fragment of memory flickered past. Darkness, silence, no one. She was abandoned. Aurelia blinked, yet that sensation did not vanish. I comprehend now. Valerius's voice rose. He stood there, not approaching, not touching anyone, merely looking as if observing an entity that required elimination. A human devoid of a wolf, yet making my 2 children submissive. He paused for a beat. That is no coincidence. Aurelia shook her head very slightly. She did not fathom. Sorcery. That word fell frigid and categorical. Aurelia went rigid. Sorcery. She did not even possess a wolf. No power. Nothing at all. She had simply touched them. No. Her voice held nearly no sound. My lord, I merely... Enough. Valerius turned away, not looking at her again. Execute her. 2 words fell like a verdict, without hesitation, without deliberation. Behind them, the 2 infants seemed to shatter. They wept more violently than before. One of them struggled out of the wet nurse's hands, falling to the floor yet still crawling toward Aurelia. Tiny hands reached out but did not touch. Aurelia turned her head to look, her heart constricting. The 2 infants would weep again. No soul could soothe them. No soul understood them. Please, she whispered, unclear to whom she spoke. No soul answered. 2 soldiers advanced, seizing her arms. This time, she did not offer resistance. She merely looked at the 2 infants shrieking, reaching toward her as if she were the solitary entity retaining them within this world. A sensation of sharp agony diffused, not out of fear of death, but because she was departing from them, just as it had transpired a long duration ago. The door closed. The weeping was obstructed behind it, yet it did not vanish. It still resonated within her head, within her chest, without cessation. On the divergent side, Valerius stood immobile, not turning back, as if she had never existed, as if this were not the first time he had erased a life. In the darkened corridor, Aurelia was hauled away. No soul spoke of the destination, yet she knew she was being taken to a place from which no soul returned. The weeping of the 2 princesses still echoed behind, fading yet not vanishing, and not a single soul within the palace recognized that the sentence recently declared was not an end, but the commencement of an error that even the Alpha King could not rectify. Chapter 5. The Inseverable Bond. Aurelia was hauled through the long, frigid corridor, footfalls resonating with a parched regularity, as if every beat were preordained. Whispers wound behind her back, not loud yet as sharp as thin blades. Look at that girl, devoid of a wolf yet daring to touch royalty. Utilizing sorcery to garner notice. Loathsome. Aurelia did not turn. She had grown accustomed to those gazes a long duration ago. A fragment of memory fractured. Do not approach it. Devoid of a wolf, not one of us. A door slammed shut before her. Gazes of alienation. A frigid void stretching without cessation. The present overlaid the past. Still that same sensation. Being hauled. Being eliminated. She did not fathom. She merely touched them, and they had ceased their lament. So what was her error? What was her crime? The corridor concluded, space opening cold and vacant, a location known to all from which no soul returned once entered. 2 soldiers stalled, 1 advanced. Aurelia offered no resistance. She merely stood there, silent, as if everything had departed from her before she could retain it. A thought flickered. They will weep again, and this time, no soul will make them silent. On the divergent side of the palace, the weeping rose yet no longer resembled the past. It was no longer feeble or impotent, but fractured, sharp, and guttural like an entity being coerced to mutate. 2-minute frames vibrated. No soul touched them, yet they themselves were resisting an entity within. A very faint cracking resonance rose. A healer recoiled, countenance pallid. No, impossible. Their frames constricted, not from agony, but from instinct. Gazes mutated, deeper, sharper. A small snarl escaped. And then no luminosity, no miracle, merely a natural transition. 2-minute forms were transforming. Only minutes later, 2 wolf pups stood there, minute yet vivid, gazes igniting with an entity that made everyone recoil instinctively. They did not wait, did not hesitate. They lunged with swift and decisive paces, not turning back. Aurelia closed her eyes as the soldier advanced, wind brushing her face. A moment of silence. Then a very light resonance touched the space. Not footfalls, but a respiration. She opened her eyes. 2 small shadows stood before her. The entire world seemed to stall. 2 wolf pups. Aurelia did not recoil, did not fear, merely paralyzed by the realization. Elara, Lyra. Her voice vibrated very faintly. One approached, slowly, cautiously, as if fearing to startle her. It stalled before her, bowing its head, scenting lightly, slowly as if confirming an unmistakable truth, then it nestled into her. The remaining one pressed against her leg, leaning as if it were the solitary place it belonged. A warm sensation diffused through Aurelia's chest, so familiar it made her choke. She raised her hand, touching the soft fur, and in that precise instant, both wolves grew silent. Their respiration slowed, synchronized as if their pulse were linked to hers. "It is you," she whispered, nearly no longer a word. "No, you should not be here." But a noise behind intercepted. It was the sentinels they had beheld. Seize them. The air shattered. One wolf immediately turned, lowering its frame, snarling, the resonance small yet making the advancing footfalls falter. The remaining one turned to Aurelia, touching her hand lightly, then turned to run toward the corridor, stalling, turning back to look at her and waiting. Aurelia stood immobile. 1 beat, 2 beats. She looked back toward the path where, if she proceeded, everything would conclude, where she had lived, had existed, yet never truly belonged. Then she looked down at the 2 small wolves, one obstructing the rear, one waiting ahead. An entity within her mutated. For the first time she was not being hauled but was capable of choosing. Aurelia drew a breath. "Do not depart from me." She commenced walking, then running. The wolf ahead immediately provided the orientation, swift and precise, weaving through passages before any soul could react. Behind, the remaining one recoiled a step, then lunged directly at the sentinels. A collision, a shout. Yet it was not without a price. A glancing blow struck, the minute frame slipping for a beat before standing firm again, still obstructing, still snarling, still refusing to retreat. Aurelia turned her head for a fleeting instant, her heart constricting, yet she did not halt, for she was incapable. Then she persisted in running. The corridor stretched perpetually. Darkness gradually consumed the luminosity behind. Footfalls of the pursuit commenced resonating. This was no longer an escape, but the commencement of a hunt. Amidst a narrow turn, Aurelia stalled. The 2 wolves stalled accordingly. One turned, advancing toward her, scenting, then gently leaning its head into her palm. The remaining one pressed against her leg. No haste, no fear, merely stalling there. Aurelia stooped, 2 arms embracing them, very lightly, like embracing an entity she feared would vanish if constricted too firmly. "I am here." Her voice was so faint it nearly dissolved into the air. The two wolves stirred slightly, pressing closer, as if that were the answer they awaited. In that moment, no footfalls, no pursuit, no terror. Only an unnameable bond remained. But then, the resonance of footfalls rose again, closer, more hurried, severing everything. The two wolves simultaneously raised their heads, their gazes mutating rapidly, no longer softening but vigilant. One recoiled a step, beholding Aurelia, then turned toward a divergent direction. The remaining one still stood adjacent to her, but then it also slowly withdrew. Aurelia went rigid. No. She reached out her hand, but this time nothing held back. The two wolves did not advance further. They merely beheld her for a second, as if committing her to memory, then turned away. Aurelia stalled, her heart constricting. Do not. Her voice was incredibly faint, but they did not cease. One ran ahead. The remaining one stalled for a final beat, turned its head to behold her, then also vanished into the gloom. Aurelia stood there solitary, but within her a warm entity diffused and ran throughout her frame. Because she knew, this time she was no longer the one being abandoned, but the one being shielded. And for the first time, Aurelia fathomed that there are entities that depart not out of desertion, but so that she might exist. And not a single soul within the palace recognized that the entity they recently strove to fracture was not sorcery, but a bond, transcending every law they had ever known. And for the first time in her life, Aurelia was not the one left behind, but the one being hunted. Part 3. The Flight. Chapter 6. The Man Against the King. The nocturnal forest wind lashed against the skin like thin blades. Aurelia ran, no longer out of mere terror, but because stalling meant fatality. Her respiration was fractured. Blood from the wound upon her shoulder saturated the thin fabric. Every sharp branch lacerated her flesh, yet she no longer perceived any entity. Behind, those were the executioners of Valerius Drake. Halt! A roar resonated from behind. Aurelia stumbled, her frame collapsing into the damp, decayed leaves. Agony erupted, but before she could stand, a blade pointed directly at her throat. Finally, you are captured. The soldier stooped, his gaze vacant. The king desires. He did not finish. A parched resonance sliced the air. Blood sprayed. His frame collapsed directly before her. Aurelia went rigid. Behind the corpse, a shadow stood. No resonance, no prior warning, merely a presence so frigid it rendered the air viscous. The man stepped out of the gloom. He was tall, silent, and perilous. His gaze raked over her as if beholding an inert object. Then he turned his back, as if the entire event were not worth remembering. Wait, Aurelia spoke, but he had vanished as if he had never existed. That night did not release her. Footfalls rose again, more numerous, closer. Aurelia gritted her teeth, striving to stand and persist in running, but her frame had reached its limit. The dark forest densified, leaving no exit. She was cornered against a low cliff. Behind was a black void. Ahead were 3 soldiers advancing slowly and with certainty. This time, you shall not escape. Aurelia constricted her hands. If death was mandated, she would not perish like prey. She lunged. The air abruptly mutated. A gust swept through. Then brief, concise resonances. Thud, thud, thud. 3 shadows collapsed, nearly simultaneously. No shriek, no resistance. Only blood and him. That man stood amidst the corpses, the blade in his hand still dripping crimson. This time, he did not turn away. He walked directly toward Aurelia, slow and rhythmic. The pressure was so heavy it made her heart skip a beat. Before she could react, her back was pressed violently against a tree trunk. A hand constricted her throat, lifting her. Air was throttled. She looked directly into his eyes, perceiving only a chill. Not the chill of apathy, but the chill of an entity that had slaughtered too many to feel any entity further. You originate from his palace, he spoke, his voice low. Aurelia did not answer. I can scent that odor. The constriction intensified. Only a fractional amount more and she would perish. Yet she did not plead, did not struggle, merely looking directly at him in silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The hand released. She fell, coughing violently, air rushing into her lungs like fire. The man recoiled a step. His gaze mutated very slightly, nearly imperceptible. You are divergent from them. Aurelia looked up, her voice hoarse. And you are also divergent from an ordinary murderer. A silence stretched, the forest wind blowing past. He turned away, "Do not follow me." But destiny inquired of no soul. The night grew deeper, colder. Aurelia no longer possessed the strength to walk. She sat leaning against a tree root, her vision blurring. An arrow sliced the wind, impaling the ground adjacent to her. She started. Shadows stepped from the forest, not ordinary soldiers, but assassins. The prey is here. Aurelia bit her lip. She could no longer run. This time, it truly concluded here. A very faint sigh rose from behind. Then a violent wind surged. Once more he manifested. No longer silent, no longer observing, but slaughtering. His movements were so swift the naked eye could not track. The blade in his hand traced lethal curves, slicing through the air. Blood sprayed, metal collided, bones fractured, the resonance of falling. Within several breaths, everything concluded. Yet a blade managed to lacerate his shoulder, blood seeping out. He stood immobile, as if perceiving nothing. Aurelia looked at him. "You are wounded." Silence. His voice cut her off. The battle concluded as swiftly as it had manifested. But this time, he did not depart. That night they spoke nothing further. Aurelia awakened amidst the chill. A cloak shrouded her frame. She looked up. He sat several paces away, back leaning against a tree, eyes closed yet not sleeping. The blade remained in his hand and perpetually in a state of readiness. "Why did you return?" she asked faintly. A long silence. "I do not desire your death within my sight. Only that." The succeeding morning, luminosity pierced the canopy. Aurelia awakened. The wound upon her shoulder had been bandaged neatly and firmly. She looked down. The fragment of fabric was from his garment. She looked up. He still stood there, looking toward the horizon, toward the palace. "Who are you?" she asked. He remained silent, then spoke, slowly. "I once stood in the position he currently occupies." Aurelia went rigid. A throne, a vow, an entity that turned its back. "Valerius Drake," she whispered. His gaze darkened. "Do not mention his name." A silence. "I must return," Aurelia said. He turned his head. "You shall perish. Still must return." "For what?" "2 infants and my inquiries." Her voice was small yet certain. "They require me, and I also require the rationale." His gaze faltered, very slightly. "You are foolish," he said. "Perhaps," she responded, "but I shall not abandon them." He stood immobile for a long duration. Then, as if erupting from the deepest location, "I also once thought thus." That night, Aurelia awakened. Something was erroneous. She turned. He was not sleeping. He stood there, looking toward the remote palace. His gaze was not hatred, but an entity colder than hate. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. The wind blew past, bearing the scent of night and blood. He turned back, his gaze touching her. For the first time, it was no longer the gaze of a stranger, but a promise. "If he desires you." His voice was low, distinct, frigid to the bone. "I shall annihilate his entire kingdom." Chapter 7. The Discarded Princess. Early morning wind brushed through the forest canopy, bearing the residual chill of the night, winding through Aurelia's heavy respiration as she walked upon a path simultaneously familiar and remote. Every footfall seemed to haul the entire past behind, yet she did not stall, nor did she turn back. She knew an individual remained behind her, not speaking, not approaching, merely walking silently like an inseparable shadow. Cale did not inquire as to her destination, nor did he require a rationale, for from the instant she decided to return, he understood this was no journey of homecoming, but a step into a terminal zone. As they approached the forest bordering the imperial domain, the atmosphere commenced mutating. The faint scent of blood drifted in the wind, chaotic footprints imprinted upon the damp earth, branches pulverized like vestiges of a recently transpired panic. Then a resonance rose, not of a beast, but a nascent, distorted, and primal roar. Aurelia stalled for a solitary heartbeat, then stepped swifter, piercing through the dense thicket. A clearing manifested before her. Several sentinels stood back, gazes tense, no soul daring to advance a further step. A servant lay upon the ground, hands saturated with blood, and in the center of it all were 2 children, or more precisely, the twin princesses recently transformed into 2 small wolf pups. They stood close to one another, eyes igniting with a feral amber hue, respiration hurried, frames vibrating from uncontrollable instinct. When a soldier shifted closer, They immediately snarled, the resonance small yet sufficient to make him recoil in terror. "Do not approach," he shrieked upon seeing Aurelia advance. "They will attack anyone." But Aurelia did not stall. She persisted in walking with slow, certain paces, bearing no terror. Kael stood behind, his gaze darkening, frame tensing in silence. He did not obstruct her, yet his eyes never departed from the two infants. With a solitary, erroneous movement, he would act before any soul could realize. Aurelia stalled several paces from them, then slowly knelt. No invoking of names, no speech, merely extending her hand forward silently, her palm open as if offering a wordless invitation. The space became suffocatingly still. The two infants snarled lightly, recoiling half a step, gazes locked upon her. Then, very slowly, they tilted their heads, drawing a profound breath as if searching for something familiar within her scent. One step, then another, until one touched her hand, an instant stretching perpetually. Then both lunged toward her, nestling deep into her embrace, like children who had recently rediscovered their place of belonging. No more snarling, no more terror, only a strange tranquility remained. The surrounding individuals went immobile, no soul fathoming what was transpiring, no soul having ever touched them while in such a state. Aurelia embraced them lightly, the motion as natural as respiration, as if she had performed this for an entire lifetime. And precisely then, "Leah," a trembling voice rose from behind. Aurelia went rigid. She turned her head. A woman stood amidst the feeble luminosity piercing the canopy, frail, exhausted, yet bearing a garment of unmistakable status. It was the queen. She beheld her, her gaze seemingly shattering. "Leah," her voice choked. "My daughter." The surrounding space seemed to collapse in an instant. She rushed forward, embracing Aurelia firmly, her arms constricting as if fearing that with a solitary release, she would vanish again. "You are alive," she whispered, her voice fractured. "I conjectured I had lost you." Aurelia did not respond. She did not push her away yet. She did not embrace back. Merely standing immobile, letting those arms constrict her, as if her frame no longer belonged to her. "I apologize." The queen tremblingly touched her countenance. "I was unable to protect you." Aurelia looked at her. Her gaze was vacant, without a ripple. "So, what am I?" Her voice was so light it nearly dissolved into the air. "All this duration, what was I?" The queen could not answer immediately. Tears fell, every drop heavy. "You are my firstborn daughter," she spoke, every word as if being rent from her heart. "But you were divergent. You possessed no wolf." The air froze. In this world, that was not merely a difference. It was an error. "I attempted," she choked. "But he discarded you. Not slaughter, not exile, but discarded, like an entity without value that inherently should not exist." Aurelia did not weep, did not tremble, merely standing there, silent, as if every emotion had been drained. The two infants hauled lightly at her hand. She looked down. They were beholding her, gazes clear, no longer feral, no longer terrified. One whispered, very faintly, "Sister." The resonance was so small it seemed to dissolve, yet it possessed the strength to pierce through everything. Aurelia said nothing, but her hand constricted slightly. Behind her, Kael still stood and maintained silence, not intervening yet. His gaze never departed from her, and his frame remained in a position of readiness between her and any peril. Abruptly, a figure rushed from the forest, breathing heavily, collapsing before Kael. "My lord!" The air immediately tensed. "News," he spoke hurriedly. "The Alpha King knows she is alive." A heavy silence weighed upon all. No soul stirred, no soul spoke. Aurelia turned to Kael. No inquiry, no requirement. Kael looked back at her, his gaze darkening, deep and irretrievable. "From now," he spoke with a low and firm voice, "there will be no path of return, a respiration." Aurelia responded without hesitation. "I never possessed one." In a divergent location, within the frigid palace, moonlight shone upon the stone floor white as ice. Valerius Drake stood before a high window frame, his back straight, immobile like a statue. A subordinate knelt behind, head bowed low. "We have confirmed. She is still alive." Silence stretched. Then Valerius opened his eyes, his gaze containing no rage, no surprise, only absolute chill. This time, he spoke slowly, every word falling like a verdict. "I shall personally conclude it." Part 4. The Return of the Rejected Princess. Chapter 8. Hunted. The forest wind still carried the residual chill of the previous night, yet this time no tranquility remained. The ground vibrated slightly beneath hurried footfalls from afar, as if the entire forest were being lacerated by a relentless pursuit. Aurelia stood amidst a small clearing, the two infants embracing her firmly, clinging to her as the solitary entity preventing them from falling into chaos. Behind, the queen had not yet entirely recovered from the recent shock, her gaze following Aurelia with a silent agony. As for KL, he no longer stood immobile. He tilted his head, listening, every muscle tensing like a predatory beast. Then he spoke, very faintly, yet sufficient to make the air freeze. "They have arrived." No soul inquired who. There was no requirement. A long howl resonated from afar, frigid and sharp as a blade. Not of a wild wolf, but a signal of the hunt. Aurelia slightly constricted her hold upon the two infants, perceiving their trembling heartbeats. Yet this time, she did not panic, no longer the one being hunted. She stood straight, her gaze stable. "We must depart." Kale offered no objection. He turned immediately, providing the orientation deep into the forest, choosing the darkest and most arduous paths, as if he had grown accustomed to being hunted for an entire lifetime. Aurelia followed closely behind, the two infants not departing from her for a fractional pace. Every time Kale increased his celerity, they looked toward her, awaiting a slight nod. Only when she acquiesced did they persist in running. The queen beheld everything, and for the first time, she understood she had not merely lost one child, but all three. An arrow sliced the wind, impaling the ground directly before Aurelia's feet. Kale immediately stalled, hauling her backward. His gaze darkened. They are swifter than we conjectured. Figures gradually manifested amidst the forest. Not ordinary soldiers, but authentic predators. High-ranking alphas, entities capable of pulverizing the will of others merely through their presence. The atmosphere grew heavy. The two infants vibrated, instinct making them recoil close to Aurelia. The queen faltered, nearly unable to stand firm. Yet Aurelia did not bow her head, did not retreat. She stepped forward, then another step, standing amidst it all. "Behind me." Her voice was not loud, yet sufficient to make Kale go rigid. He looked at her, for the first time not as beholding an individual requiring protection, but as observing an entity he could not yet entirely fathom. An alpha advanced, his gaze frigid. "Surrender her, and I shall permit the remaining ones to exist." Kale offered a faint smile, the expression bearing no joy. "Attempt it." The air shattered. The battle erupted in an instant. Metal collided, roars resonated, movements so swift the naked eye could not track. Kale fought like a ruthless tempest, precise, leaving nothing behind. Yet the numbers were too vast. An alpha lunged, the collision making Kale slide back a step. Only a step, yet sufficient for the opponent to smile coldly. "You have grown weak, Kale." Aurelia beheld this, and she did not reflect. She stepped directly into the center. "Stop." Her voice was not loud, yet everything stalled. Not out of fear, but because of an invisible entity. The alpha went rigid, his gaze wavering for a brief instant. Kale also stalled, his eyes fixed upon her, clearly perceiving something was erroneous. The two infants nestled closer to Aurelia. Their respiration gradually stabilized. Their gazes were no longer feral. The queen stood behind, hands trembling. She recognized that the girl had no requirement for a wolf, for she herself was the entity that made wolves listen. Another lunged from behind, snarling, "Do not listen to her." But before he could touch, Kale manifested in front. His blade sliced the wind, blood sprayed. Yet this time, he did not cease. His gaze darkened, deeper, as if falling into an uncontrollable state. He lunged into the fray like a beast devoid of command, no longer distinguishing, no longer possessing limits. "Aurelia," the queen invoked. Yet she had advanced without hesitation. She touched Kale's hand. With a solitary touch, Kale went rigid, as if an entity had hauled him from the abyss. His respiration was heavy, gaze still crimson, yet gradually returning. He looked down at her hand, touching him, then looked up. Two gazes met. No soul spoke, yet both understood. Something had mutated. The remaining ones recoiled, not because of Kyle, but because of her. They retreated, the forest returning to silence. Kyle still stood there. Aurelia had not yet withdrawn her hand. The distance between them was so close they could perceive every breath. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then Kael hauled her close, not gently, without warning. The kiss descended like a rugged tempest, violent, filled with instinct. Not a choice, but an entity impossible to obstruct. Aurelia was stunned for a beat, yet she did not push him away. The kiss concluded as abruptly as it had commenced. Kael recoiled. Respiration hurried, gaze returning to its previous frigid state as if nothing had transpired. Aurelia said nothing, merely looking at him a fractional amount longer, then turned away. No soul mentioned it. Yet from that moment, everything was divergent. Kael turned his back. "We must depart." His voice dropped. "Next time, he shall not send soldiers again." A silence. "He shall come personally." Aurelia slightly constricted her hold upon the two infants, her gaze no longer that of an individual fleeing, but of an individual awaiting a confrontation. And somewhere, very remote, a frigid wind commenced shifting direction. War had commenced. Chapter 9. The Truth Regarding Kael. Following the battle, the forest returned to an abnormally silent state, yet it was not tranquility. It was the heavy stillness following a hunt, where the scent of blood still lingered in the air, and the canopy flickered slightly, as if not yet forgetting what had recently transpired. Kael did not permit them to stall immediately. He provided the orientation deeper into the forest, through unpredictable paths, until certain no vestiges of pursuit remained. Only then did he halt in a small clearing, where feeble luminosity could pierce through the dense thicket. "It is temporarily stable here," he spoke, his voice low and concise. No soul responded. Aurelia sat down first and immediately. The two infants pressed against her as a reflex, requiring no reflection. One leaned its head upon her shoulder. The remaining one grasped her hand firmly. They did not look at Kael, nor did they look at the queen. They only looked at her, only trusted her. The queen stood several paces away. She beheld that scene for a long duration, her gaze no longer that of a mother rediscovering her children, but of an individual who recently recognized she had lost everything a long duration ago. Yet she did not approach, for she did not dare. Kael stood at the edge of the clearing, his back turned toward them, the sharp blade still remaining in his hand like a portion of his frame. But his gaze no longer tracked the forest. It drifted somewhere more remote. Aurelia looked at him for a long duration. Then she gently withdrew her hand from the two infants. They retained her for an instant, as if fearing being abandoned again, but she merely touched their hair lightly. "I shall return," she spoke faintly. They said nothing, but also slowly released their hold. Aurelia stood up, walking to where Kael stood, stalling behind him at a sufficient interval. "You knew he would arrive," she spoke, her voice calm. Not an inquiry. Kael did not turn back. "Yes, because you fathom how he thinks." A silence transpired. The wind swept past, making the canopy above waver. Then Kael spoke, slow and deep. "Because I once stood in the position he occupies." Aurelia did not react immediately. She looked at him, her gaze sharpening slightly. Not once could have. She spoke every word clearly, but once did. Kael remained silent, and this time he did not deny. "I was chosen," he spoke, as if narrating regarding another individual. Before him. The atmosphere grew heavy. Before Valerius Drake became Alpha King, his voice gradually lowered. "I was the one destined to sit upon that throne." Aurelia slightly constricted her hand. Then why? "Because he refused it." A voice rose from behind. The queen stepped out from the shadow of the trees, the feeble light shining upon her countenance, revealing exhaustion and an entity resembling guilt. Kael turned back. The gazes of the two met. There was no respect, only the past. "You knew," Kael spoke, his voice growing cold. "I was there," the queen responded, without evasion. That night, Aurelia looked between the two, feeling as if she stood before a portion of history that had never been narrated. "What transpired?" she asked. A long silence stretched. Then the queen spoke, her voice slow and heavy. "To become Alpha King, the chosen one must prove that he can place power above all else." She looked at Kael. "By slaughtering." Aurelia furrowed her brow, slaughtering an enemy. Kael spoke, his voice devoid of emotion. "No, an innocent." The air went rigid. "That was the law." The queen spoke, but her voice was no longer stable. "An alpha must prove that he is not shackled by any entity." Aurelia turned to Kael, "And you refused." Kael offered a faint smile, an expression so slight it nearly did not exist. "I did not slaughter." "And Valerius," Aurelia whispered, "performed it in my stead," Kael concluded. No rage, No resentment. Merely a truth accepted a long duration ago. The wind blew stronger, making the leaves rustle. The queen closed her eyes for an instant, as if that memory were still too heavy. Following that night, everything mutated. No, Kale interrupted. Not mutated. He looked directly at her, but usurped. The space went silent. Aurelia spoke nothing, but she understood. This was not merely a betrayal, but a path expropriated, and an individual who had been pushed out of his own fate. "Do you desire to reclaim it?" she asked, with a light but clear voice. The question fell like a stone. Kale looked at her for a long duration, then shook his head. "I never desired the throne. A beat, but I want him to pay the price." The air grew cold. Aurelia turned her head to look toward the two infants. They were still beholding her, not departing their gaze, as if everything surrounding them was insignificant. She turned back to look at Kale, speaking nothing further, but within her gaze, a decision existed. This time she no longer stood solitary. Chapter 10. The Ultimate Hunt. The wind ceased blowing. Not because the forest grew still, but because an entity more formidable was compressing everything. Aurelia stood amidst the clearing, the two infants behind no longer clinging to her as before, but standing adjacent, as if they had opted for their positions. No soul commanded them to perform this, yet instinct made them fathom that the most secure location was behind her back. Kale stepped up, stalling beside her, not shielding, not leading, but standing in alignment. The queen advanced slowly, every footfall seemingly heavier than the last. "It is time. You must know everything." Her voice no longer trembled, leaving only the truth. Aurelia did not turn. "I know sufficient already." "Not yet," the queen shook her head. "What you know is merely the rationale they desired you to believe, not the truth." The atmosphere grew heavy. "You possess no wolf," the queen spoke, her gaze not departing from Aurelia, "not because you are weak or in error." A pause. "But because you have no requirement for it." The wind stopped entirely. "You are the entity that stands before even the wolf, before even the alpha." Kale slightly constricted his hand. An invisible pressure brushed past him, not potent yet sufficient to make him falter for an instant. "You are the origin of the bond." The words fell, and the forest seemed to react. The two infants behind simultaneously raised their heads, their gazes no longer feral but recognizing. An invisible wave radiated from Aurelia, not violent, not clamorous, but deep and irresistible. Kale stalled for only a second. A very brief second his knee touched the ground. Then he stood up immediately, as if nothing had ever transpired. The queen beheld this, and she understood. The bond between wolves, between alpha and pack, all commence from you. She spoke, her voice slow. "You can create it, and you can also fracture it." Silence. "That is the rationale Valerius could not permit you to exist." The wind returned, stronger. "If you exist," a pause, "no alpha remains a king anymore." This time, Aurelia turned. Her gaze no longer searched for an answer, for she had understood. "So," her voice dropped, "if I am that potent," she looked directly at the queen, "why did you still abandon me?" The question fell, sharp as a blade. The queen took a further step, but stalled. "Because I feared." Her voice fractured for an instant, then constricted. "I feared you would not possess a life. I feared this entire world would hunt you." Aurelia stood immobile, not weeping, not trembling. But only she knew her heart was being constricted so firmly by an entity that she seemingly could not breathe. Then she turned away. "He did not discard me." The utterance rose, clear and cold. The queen went rigid. Kale looked at her. Aurelia raised her head, her gaze directed straight ahead, where they all knew who was approaching. "He fears me." A beat. "He fears one day I shall make him no longer a king." The air shattered. A horrific pressure descended. Without warning, without a requirement for signs. Trees vibrated. A nearby trunk emitted a cracking resonance, then fractured in half. The queen knelt. The two infants recoiled, but did not depart from Aurelia. Kale did not kneel, he stepped up, standing as a shield. But Aurelia did not retreat. She stepped up in alignment, standing straight, confronting. A figure stepped out from the gloom, slowly, without a requirement for haste. That was Alpha King Valerius Drake. His gaze raked over all, not stalling until it touched her. "So," his voice was deep, "you are still alive." No soul responded. Pressure from him radiated like an invisible wave, compressing everything. The queen could not stand. The two infants bowed their heads, The air grew so dense it was impossible to breathe. But Aurelia did not bow. Cale also did not. Valerius stalled for a very brief instant. He took a further step, the pressure increasing. Yet it still did not touch her. For the first time, his gaze mutated. Not rage, not surprise, but understanding. He offered a very faint smile, yet it was frigid to the bone. Finally, his gaze locked upon Aurelia. I also fathom why I cannot control you. No soul stirred. Aurelia looked directly at Valerius, without fear, without evasion. And in that moment, Valerius Drake recognized the one who could conclude him was not Cale, but the very daughter he had discarded. Chapter 11. The Collapse of a Sovereign. Pressure compressed the forest like a sky poised to collapse. No soul dared to stir. No soul dared a profound respiration. Valerius Drake stood there, requiring no action. Merely existing was sufficient to make all entities bow. Cale took a step forward, slow yet decisive, closing the interval between the two, no longer the distance of enemies, but of two who once stood upon the identical summit. You arrive late, Cale spoke, his voice low and frigid. Valerius did not respond immediately, his gaze still placed upon Aurelia, as if all other entities were not worthy of concern. Then very slowly, he shifted his gaze to Cale. You are still alive, he spoke, a very faint smile flickering past. I conjectured, you had learned the method to vanish. Cale did not smile. I have learned the method to wait. The atmosphere tensed to an extent that with a solitary erroneous beat, everything would shatter. You remain as before, Valerius spoke, still choosing to stand beside the weak. Cale constricted his hand. I choose to protect. A pause. While you only know how to dominate. Two gazes locked, not merely two alphas confronting, but two worlds colliding. Order must be maintained, Valerius spoke, his voice even and cold. A world cannot exist without an entity standing above all. No, Cale responded. A world exists because they choose to remain. The air fractured. Valerius stepped forward, the pressure skyrocketing. Surrounding trees vibrated violently. A nearby trunk fractured across with a parched, cracking resonance. You never understood, he spoke. The freedom you speak of is merely chaos. Cale did not retreat. And your order is merely shackles. In that instant, Valerius vanished. Not truly vanished, but so swift no soul managed to behold. A heavy thud. The blade from Cale's back was drawn rapidly, obstructing the first strike, metal colliding like a lightning strike. Yet the force was too vast. He was pushed back. 1 step, 2 steps. Valerius did not cease. The second blow descended, swifter, heavier. Cale obstructed, but this time his knee touched the ground. The two infants behind vibrated. The queen knelt, unable to resist the repressive pressure. Valerius stood above Cale, looking down, devoid of emotion. This is the conclusion for those who repudiate power. The blade rose for a beat, then descended. Stop. Aurelia stepped into the center. Not swift, not hurried, yet impossible to be obstructed. The blade of Valerius stalled, only a very small interval from Cale. His hand trembled slightly, not because he desired to stop, but because he was incapable of proceeding. Aurelia stood between them, not touching him nor resisting, merely standing there. Her gaze was without fear, without retreat. Move aside, Valerius spoke, his voice still cold, yet no longer certain. Aurelia shook her head. No. The air vibrated, not from power, but from volition. Valerius constricted his hand, the blade in his hand vibrating. Aurelia looked directly at him. You are not my king. Silence. Behind her, Cale stood up. For the first time, he did not step ahead but stood behind her. Yet his voice rose, deep and perilous. If he touches you, I shall not leave any vestige of him. Not a threat, but the truth. The resonance of footfalls rose. The queen advanced. Not kneeling, not trembling. She stood straight, confronting Valerius. Enough. Valerius did not turn back immediately, but he listened. You are not losing a throne, the queen spoke. You are losing a family. The atmosphere grew heavy. Valerius turned his head slowly. His gaze touched her. The queen did not evade. For the first time, her voice dropped. My daughter stands before you. A pause. Do not force her to choose to slaughter her own father. Time seemed to stall. No soul stirred. The blade in Valerius's hand constricted, then slowly loosened. Clang. The blade fell upon the ground. The resonance rose clearly, frigidly. and in that instant, a sovereign had collapsed. Valeria stood immobile, not speaking, not moving. For the first time he did not fathom what should be performed, whether to slaughter the enemy before him or to retain the daughter he had discarded. And for the first time, the Alpha King hesitated. Chapter 12. The New Order. The pressure dissipated, not vanishing instantly, but receding gradually like an entity that had existed too long and finally released its hold. The forest grew light, the air no longer compressing the chest. For the first time, no soul had to bow to breathe. Valerius Drake still stood there, immobile. The blade lay beneath his feet, as frigid as the very power he once wielded. He looked down at it for a long duration, his gaze no longer sharp, nor possessing authority. It was merely a vacant look, as if he were observing the very entity that had taken everything from him. Then, he did not retrieve it. In that moment, no soul needed to announce it. No battle needed to conclude. Everyone understood. The Alpha King was no longer the Alpha King. Deep within the forest, the other alphas simultaneously faltered, as if an invisible cord had recently been severed. No soul issued a mandate, yet all perceived it. The bond had mutated. No more coerced pressure, no more absolute control, only instinct and choice remained. Valerius raised his eyes to behold Aurelia, no longer the gaze of a ruler, but of an individual who had recently lost. I constructed this entire kingdom. His voice dropped, no longer piercing. Yet I could not retain my own children. No soul responded. There was no requirement, for that was not a justification but the price mandated, the exchange made. He recoiled a step. No soul forced him, no soul attacked, but it was the retreat of a sovereign. The queen closed her eyes briefly, tears falling silently. Valerius turned away, stalling for an instant, looking back at the queen, the twins, and finally Aurelia. I shall not obstruct you further. Only a concise sentence, yet it was the terminal point for everything he once possessed. Wind blew softly through the forest, no longer bearing pressure. Aurelia stood immobile, and did not look at him again. Not restraining, not lingering. Then she turned and walked toward Kyle, slow yet certain. Every pace was a choice. Kyle did not advance, did not invoke her name, merely standing there and awaiting. Aurelia stalled before him. The interval between them was so close they could perceive every respiration. This time, her voice rose faintly. I am not fleeing anymore. A silent beat. Kyle looked at her without speaking, but his gaze no longer retained the frigid and deep, unpredictable mask. He hauled her close, without hesitation, without slowing, and stooped. The instant his lips touched hers, the wind ceased, space grew silent. Then a wave radiated, not pressure, not coerced power, but connection. Afar, the wolves simultaneously raised their heads, not hauled, not forced, merely perceiving. And for the first time, the bond was not created for control, but for connection. Aurelia did not evade, did not recoil. She placed her hands upon Kale's shoulders, retaining him as a reciprocal response and acceptance. Behind, the two infants ran forward, without lingering, without terror. They embraced Aurelia, as if finally retaining the entity that belonged to them. You shall not depart again, correct. The voice of a small one rose, trembling slightly. Aurelia stooped, touching her forehead to theirs. No. Only a solitary word, yet sufficient to retain their entire small world. The queen advanced. This time, not stalling, she stood behind them, no longer severed, no longer standing outside. The family for the first time stood together. Afar, a wolf howl resonated, not a signal of the hunt, but a summons of freedom. Kale stood beside Aurelia, not as a king, and having no requirement for it, and Aurelia, not an Omega or a Luna, yet she remained the center. Not for control, but for equilibrium. The world had mutated, no longer a solitary Alpha King, no longer an entity standing above all. Only those who opted to stand together remained. Wind drifted through the forest gently. No more pressure, no more terror, only peace. No soul remembered a solitary Alpha King anymore, but all remembered the girl once discarded, who became the individual whom the entire world chose. Bonus chapter. Tranquility. Night descended very slowly, as if the world were also relearning the method of being still. A small fire burned within the wooden house, casting warm patches of luminosity upon the walls. Outside, the forest still breathed, yet no longer bearing a sense of menace, Only wind, only leaves, only a location where no soul had to run anymore. Aurelia stood by the open window frame, looking out at the darkness stretching before her eyes. She could not sleep, not out of fear, but because for the first time, there was nothing further to fear. Her hands slightly constricted as if testing whether all of this were authentic. A footfall behind. No resonance yet she knew who it was. "Are you not sleeping?" she asked faintly, not turning back. Kale did not respond immediately. He stood behind her, close enough to perceive the warmth, yet not rushing to touch her immediately, as if still granting her a space, an entity she never possessed before. "You as well," he finally spoke. A light silence fell between them. The wind swept past, bearing the scent of damp and frigid forest. Aurelia slightly shuddered, and then a hand placed upon hers, warm, certain. He did not grasp firmly, merely held it there. Aurelia slightly went rigid, not withdrawing, not evading, merely standing still, perceiving. "I do not fathom," she spoke very faintly, nearly merging into the wind, "how to live an ordinary life." Kale remained silent. Then he stepped closer. No haste, no coercion, only sufficient, so the interval between them no longer existed. Then his voice dropped. "Do not live ordinarily." A pause. "Living with me is sufficient." Aurelia turned back, her gaze touching him, no longer guarded, no longer hesitating. Only a choice remained. Kale raised his hand, touching her neck lightly, precisely where his vestige remained. Not forceful, not possessive, merely a touch. Aurelia inhaled slightly. A very light tremor ran along her spine, yet she did not retreat, did not evade. Conversely, she proactively placed her hand upon his chest, retaining him. This time she opted. Kale did not wait further. He stooped. The kiss did not descend like a tempest, not hurried, not violent, but slow, deep as if he were relearning the method to touch her without making her fracture. Aurelia closed her eyes and gently responded. Not instinct, but volition. Their respiration merged, everything surrounding dissolved. Only they remained, only their interwoven warmth, merging into one. And for the first time no soul had to haul another out of the gloom. Dawn arrived along with soft luminosity piercing through the window. A small noise. Then the door transitioned open. "Sister," two small shadows lunged into the room. Aurelia had not yet managed to open her eyes before being hauled up. "You promised. You are not permitted to sleep anymore." She erupted into laughter, her voice still slightly hoarse from the brief slumber. The two infants climbed onto the bed, hauling her hands, embracing firmly as if fearing she would vanish. Kale sat leaning against the headboard, observing the scene, silently enjoying this tranquility. His gaze softened. One of the two small ones turned toward him. "You must also awaken." Kale went rigid for a rare instant, then permitted himself to be hauled in. Aurelia beheld all, and for the first time she laughed authentically, a joyful laugh bearing warmth and happiness. Not a forced smile, not holding back, merely a light smile, yet sufficient to mutate the entire room. At the door, the queen stood there. She did not enter immediately, merely looking silently as if fearing to fracture this joyful and happy moment. Aurelia beheld her, a very light pause. Then, "Mother," her voice was not loud yet sufficient. The queen went rigid, her gaze vibrating. Then she entered slowly but did not cease. Her hand touched Aurelia's hair very lightly, as if touching an entity she once thought she had lost perpetually. No soul spoke further, for it was unnecessary. All of this was sufficient. Outside, the world had mutated. No more those who bowed in terror. No more a solitary alpha standing above all. Only those who opted to remain. A group of individuals passed by, bowing their heads not out of fear, but out of respect. Aurelia stepped outside, wind blowing lightly through her hair. Kale stood beside her, not occupying a higher position, merely standing there, adjacent to her, like a portion of her. A wolf from afar raised its head, beholding them then howled, not to hunt, but to summon. Aurelia looked toward the horizon, a world no longer resembling the past. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Kale did not look at the world, he looked at her. Only regret a solitary entity. Aurelia turned. "What is it?" A pause. "Not finding you sooner." The wind swept past, bearing the scent of a new commencement. No soul remembered a solitary Alpha King anymore. No more throne, no more entity standing above all. Only a location where no soul had to be discarded anymore. And at its center was the girl once abandoned. the individual who opted to remain and was opted back by the entire world.